Hi, I'm Ian Griffiths, and this is a talk in the Building Business Applications of Silverlight 4 series. In this talk, we're going to look at authentication and related issues. So, for almost all web applications, you're going to want to have some means of knowing that the user is allowed to do the things they're trying to do. And it might simply be a case of the application is accessible to certain sort of people and not accessible to everyone. But it might also be that you need to present per user information. You might need to present customized information. There might be details that are different from one user to another. There might be profile details, for example. Or it might even be that you have different classes of users. So in the example application that we're building in this series of talks, this event administration application, normal attendees using the site want to be shown lists of which events are available and to be able to sign up to the things, whereas event administrators are going to be able to edit and create events, change the tracks and change the talks that make them up. So we need to be able to provide different sorts of information, different UI, different behavior based on who's logged in. Now, in general with Silverlight, often you can just use exactly the same mechanisms here that you would use in a web application. And in particular, if your Silverlight UI is part of some larger web application, so if you've got other web pages and you've got some existing log-on mechanism, chances are you'll be able to piggyback off that. So for example, if you're using ASP.NET forms-based authentication, that'll end up sending a cookie back to the browser once the user is logged in. And if you use the default mechanisms in Silverlight to talk to a web service on the same system, that cookie will just get passed in as part of the natural order of things, and you'll just carry on being authenticated to the same user. If alternatively you're using integrated Windows authentication, then again that will just work. By default, the HTTP stack will simply authenticate the user to the server and it will just work. There are some other more complicated options we're going to look at later on in the series when it comes to using the client HTTP stack, but for the most part, things can just work. However, we're using RIA services. We're using WCF RIA services to present the user interface, and it actually provides its own authentication mechanism because it's possible to build a WCF RIA services application that never has any HTML-based user interface at all. The only way we use the HTML is to load the Silverlight plugin in the first place, and we can actually handle the login wholly within the Silverlight UI. Now, under the covers, it turns out that RIA Services is still using the same ASP.NET mechanisms. It's using the membership and role and profile providers to do the actual work under the covers. It uses the same APIs in the server side and ends up pushing a cookie back in the same way. The only real difference is that we're logging on by using an API provided by RIA Services rather than logging on through a web form. But ultimately, it's the same basic mechanism. Now, RIA Services actually provides intrinsic features designed specifically to help support the notion of being logged in and logged out and authentication and so on. As we already saw earlier, there's a specialized base class that a domain service can derive from called Authentication Base that provides the basic server-side pieces, and that's what layers on top of the ASP.NET membership and role provider information. On the client side, no matter what domain services you've offered, you always get a special context called the web context that doesn't correspond directly to any particular web service. It's just a general purpose feature you get in all RIA Services clients that provides information that is common to applications. And one of those things is the idea of whether the user is logged in or not and which roles the user currently belongs to. So this is all built in as a standard part of the API. The web authentication, the web context authentication property provides you with the ability to log in and log out. It provides operations you can invoke, and then it offers a user property that returns an iPrincipal. And iPrincipal is the standard .NET representation for a logged in user's identity and role membership. You have to configure the web context in your app.xaml to actually load this information so it knows what form of authentication it's using. So if you take a look at the app.xaml of a RIA Services application, you'll see that there's an object in there that configures things. Let's take a quick look at that. So here is my Event Manager application that we've been working on so far. And if I just take a quick look in the app.xaml, you can see the application lifetime objects section. This is a standard Silverlight feature that is used to hold objects that need to be running for the entire duration of the application. And RIA Services expects this to contain an object to handle authentication. And in this case, you can see we configured the use of forms authentication. This tells RIA Services that we're not using integrated Windows authentication, but that we'd like to use instead the underlying ASP.NET mechanism for supporting forms authentication. If you uncomment this line, then instead you'll get Windows Auth for integrated authentication. So if we run the application, in fact I've already got it running here, up at the top right hand corner, applications built on top of the Silverlight business application template always get this little login thing here. And this uses the web context. It actually looks at the web context to see if you're logged in right now. And if you're not, it will show a login link that you can click. And if you click this, a login UI pops up. If I type in some credentials, and I already created a user account earlier before running this demo. So if I just log in as myself, that will contact the server. It ends up invoking an operation on the authentication-based domain service that's added by the wizard and passes my credentials, and that uses the ASP.NET Membership API to log me in. And you can see now it's actually showing my name here. It's saying welcome Ian Griffiths because it knows who I am, and rather than providing a login button, it provides a log out button. And obviously if I get things wrong, if I type in a bad person, a bad password, then it will just show me an error there. There's one more thing this provides, and again this is part of the business application template, and this is not a standard REST services library feature. This is specifically a feature added by the template, which is if I've not already logged in, I can click on this register now link here, and the form turns around and gives me the ability to sign up with a new account. So this, as I say, is not an intrinsic feature. The business application template adds a service specifically to support this. So in the services folder of a newly created business application, you get this user registration service, which does still sit on top of the membership and role services provided by ASP.NET, but it provides a not exactly standard method, an add user method that we can call to create a new user. And this is just one of the bonus features you get from the default template. So, in Silverlight in general, whether you're using REST services or not, you tend to rely ultimately on the usual mechanisms, either integrated authentication or some sort of cookie-based mechanism, either using an HTML-based web form for standard forms-based authentication, or possibly a REST services or a web service wrapper on top of that, or of course you are free to use your own mechanisms as well. If you're running your own custom web service, you can authenticate against that however you like. The basic principles are the same though. We're using the web browser stack, so we authenticate in whatever way makes sense for our particular style of web application.